The year that many today call zero was not felt as such by those who lived through it. People across the world counted their calendars differently. Romans measured time by the years of their emperor's reign, while in China, dynastic cycles marked the flow of history. Farmers in the fields looked less to numbered years and more to the rhythm of planting and harvest. For them, the seasons were the truest calendar. It was a moment of quiet balance, neither an ending nor a beginning, but a continuing. The Roman world stretched wide under Augustus, who was remembered as the first emperor. Roads paved in stone connected villages and distant cities, carrying travelers on foot, carts creaking with goods, and soldiers marching in steady lines. Far to the east, the Han dynasty nurtured vast lands, where fields of millet and rice swayed under the winds of spring and autumn. Between these empires, deserts and mountains carried caravans along ancient routes, where trade was as much about stories and ideas as it was about silk or spice. The world, though divided into many lands and languages, shared something constant: the rhythm of ordinary life. Families gathered around hearths, meals were prepared from what fields and markets offered, and evenings brought rest beneath starlit skies. This is where we begin, at the threshold of an age, walking gently through the lives, lands and customs of the year known as zero, and as evening settles, we drift onward. The Roman Empire, strong and expansive, stretched across lands that seemed endless to those who walked its roads. From the misty hills of Britannia in the northwest, where damp fields rolled into forests, down through Gaul's vineyards and across the breadth of the Mediterranean, Rome's reach was visible in stone walls, aqueducts, and orderly towns. In the bustling city of Rome itself, marble temples stood bright under the sun, and narrow streets wound through crowded neighborhoods where people pressed shoulder to shoulder. Augustus, the emperor, had brought stability after decades of turmoil. His rule was firm, yet subtle, casting the impression of peace. Armies patrolled borders, but inside the empire, trade and order flourished. Farmers brought their harvests into town markets. Merchants arranged shipments of grain to feed Rome's vast population, and artisans worked in workshops that echoed with the tap of hammers and the scrape of chisels. Across the world, another great power watched over its own lands, the Han dynasty of China. Its capital, Chang'an, was a hub of government and trade, where wide boulevards were lined with markets selling silk, pottery, and bronze. Scholars worked in libraries, carefully copying texts that preserved knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Beyond the capital, villages stretched along rivers and valleys, where peasants worked fields, their daily rhythms set by sun and soil. Between these two empires lay lands not always recorded in great chronicles, but alive with their own quiet authority. In India, kingdoms prospered, their temples adorned with carvings that told stories of gods and heroes. In Africa, communities thrived along the Nile and beyond, herding cattle, tending crops, and trading along the Red Sea coast. In the Americas, far removed from these old-world empires, societies carried their own traditions, tending maize, beans, and squash, and weaving cultures that would endure for centuries. Though each land was different, all shared this truth: the empire of daily life was larger than any throne, and as evening settles, we drift onward. The heart of life in the year zero was not in palaces, but in the small hearths that glowed in homes of clay, wood, and stone. In a Roman village, walls made of plastered brick or rough stone enclosed courtyards where chickens scratched the earth and clay jars stored grain. At the centre was the hearth, where smoke curled upward through a small opening in the roof. Meals were simple but sustaining: barley porridge flavoured with herbs, coarse bread pulled from a clay oven, and when fortune allowed, olives, cheese, or dried figs. In Han China, homes built of wood and earthen walls stood in clusters along fields and rivers. A clay stove sat at the centre of family life, where millet or rice simmered in pots, sometimes with vegetables or strips of dried meat. Tea, still more a medicinal infusion than a common drink, was sipped in small bowls, warming hands against winter's chill. Meals were shared, chopsticks clicking gently against bowls, conversations carrying the calm weight of daily routine. Children helped in small ways, carrying water from a well, feeding goats or pigs, or gathering firewood for evening meals. Their laughter often echoed against the walls of courtyards, turning simple play into memory. Wooden toys, clay figurines, or simple stones arranged into games passed the hours between tasks. As night approached, the hearth glowed brighter. Light flickered on walls, shadows stretching softly across the room. Families gathered close, speaking of the day's work, the weather, or the prospects of the coming season. Outside, the world darkened into silence. Inside, warmth wrapped itself around the family like a blanket. Though Rome and China stood as vast empires, most lives unfolded quietly in homes like these, humble places where firelight marked the hours, and each dawn began the cycle again. And as evening settles, we drift onward. Markets in the year zero were places of sound and scent, where daily life spilled into streets and squares. In a Roman town, morning began with the movement of traders pushing carts loaded with baskets. The smell of fresh bread drifted from small bakeries, mingling with the tang of fish carried from nearby harbours. Voices rose as sellers called out prices, praising the freshness of figs, the sweetness of honey, or the strength of woven cloth. Coins changed hands with a soft metallic clink, bronze, silver, and gold stamped with the emperor's image. For the farmer, selling grain or olives might provide enough to buy pottery, salt, or sandals for a growing child. Merchants measured spices in small scoops, wrapped in cloth or stored in jars. Simple items, a comb of bone, a lamp of clay, a needle for sewing, were as important as luxuries. In the great city of Rome, the markets, or fora, stretched across open spaces filled with columns and arches. Vendors arranged their goods in orderly stalls, while buyers drifted slowly from one to another, inspecting olives glistening in oil, cheeses wrapped in leaves, and garlands of flowers bound with twine. The chatter of bargaining filled the air, a rhythm of offers and counter-offers that ended in nods of agreement. Far to the east, markets in Han China carried their own music of trade. In towns along the Yellow River, stalls displayed lacquerware polished to a soft shine, bolts of silk folded neatly in stacks, and baskets of ginger, garlic, and onions. Merchants from different provinces gathered, their accents mingling as they exchanged news and goods. Some carried bronze mirrors or finely crafted jade ornaments, tokens of wealth and artistry. And beyond both empires lay the roads that connected them. Caravans wound through deserts, their camels plodding steadily, bells jingling with each step. At oases, tents unfolded for the night, fires were lit, and travellers shared not only food but also stories. A merchant might describe the bustling port of Alexandria, where ships crowded the harbour, while another told of Chang'an's wide avenues and paper scrolls inked with calligraphy. The sea, too, was a pathway of trade. In Egypt's port of Berenice, ships from Arabia and India arrived with sacks of pepper, cinnamon, and precious gems. Sailors trusted the monsoon winds to carry them across the Indian Ocean, their sails billowing in steady rhythm with the sea. On return, they brought Roman glass, wines, and coins, which travelled into markets far from their place of minting. The markets of the year zero were more than places of buying and selling. They were points of connection, where goods crossed boundaries and people, in their own quiet way, became part of a world larger than their own village or town. And as evening settles, we drift onward. Faith in the year zero was woven into every part of life, as constant as the seasons and as present as the hearth's flame. People looked to the gods, to ancestors, or to teachings handed down through generations, finding comfort and guidance in rituals both grand and small. In Judea, whispers began to stir, stories of teachings, healings, and the quiet beginnings of what later would grow into Christianity. At the time, it was no grand movement. Only voices passed from person to person, in courtyards and along dusty roads. For those who lived there, faith meant prayer in the temple, the reciting of psalms, and the steady rhythm of traditions kept through feast days and fasts. In Rome, temples stood tall, their steps polished by countless feet. Jupiter, Juno, Mars, and Venus each had their altars, where incense curled into the open air, carrying prayers skyward. Families kept small shrines within their homes, where household gods, the Lares and Penates, received daily offerings, perhaps a small cake, a drop of wine, or a pinch of salt. These simple gestures bound people to the unseen, a daily thread of devotion woven into ordinary routines. Festivals were moments when faith spilled into the streets. During Saturnalia, torches blazed, gifts were exchanged, and laughter echoed late into the night. Order itself softened, roles reversed in jest, and for a time the burdens of rank and duty lifted under the watch of the gods. In China, reverence for ancestors and the balance of heaven and earth guided spiritual life. Families tended household altars, bowing before carved tablets inscribed with names of those who had gone before. Offerings of food and incense linked the living with the departed, weaving a bond that stretched across time. At temples, Taoist and Confucian teachings shaped rituals, while scholars sought harmony between human actions and the patterns of the cosmos. Across India, devotion turned toward many deities, Vishnu, Shiva, Devi, each worshipped with flowers, chants, and carved images adorned in cloth and jewels. Rituals often took place beside rivers, where the water's flow carried prayers outward like ripples. Even among smaller communities beyond great empires, faith thrived. In villages of Africa, spirits of land and water were honored, while in the Americas, rituals tied people to earth, sky, and crop. Everywhere, belief carried the same weight. It was a bridge between the seen and unseen, between the work of human hands and the mysteries of nature. Faith was never separate from life. It was its quiet undercurrent. In the planting of seeds, the setting of tables, and the gathering of families, devotion lingered. In every culture, prayers, spoken, sung, or silently held, rose like threads of smoke, disappearing into the air, yet never truly gone. And as evening settles, we drift onward. Art in the year zero was not only the province of palaces and temples, but also found in the ordinary, woven patterns on cloth, carved designs on a cup, or painted walls in a village home. Beauty was not an afterthought. It was part of life's fabric, crafted slowly and with intention. In Rome, wealthy villas glittered with mosaics, thousands of tiny stones fitted together into pictures of seashells, fish, or mythic scenes. Sunlight pouring through open courtyards caught the sparkle of colored glass and polished marble. Walls were painted with frescoes, their pigments pressed into wet plaster, creating scenes of gardens, landscapes, or quiet, still lives of fruit bowls and amphorae. Even in simpler homes, painted borders or small figures added touches of color, brightening rooms where families gathered. Sculptors in marble quarries cut great blocks from stone, their tools ringing with rhythmic taps. They carved portraits that carried the likeness of senators, soldiers, or family ancestors, giving them permanence beyond a lifetime. The folds of a toga, the curve of a cheek, the detail of hair, all captured in stone, a blend of realism and ideal. The arts in China followed a different path, yet shared the same spirit of harmony. Calligraphy was revered as more than writing. Each brushstroke carried both form and meaning, each line a reflection of balance and control. Brushes dipped in ink left marks on paper or silk, flowing with elegance, conveying poetry or philosophy with equal grace. Painters, too, worked in delicate lines, depicting landscapes of mountains, rivers, and birds, not as exact likenesses, but as expressions of nature's spirit. Crafts carried their own artistry. Lacquerware gleamed with deep reds and blacks, layered with polish until it shone like still water. Jade was carved into ornaments, its cool surface shaped into rings, pendants or animal forms believed to carry protective power. Music accompanied both ritual and leisure. In Rome, lyres and flutes sounded in banquet halls, while drums and pipes accompanied dances in marketplaces. Songs passed by voice alone, melodies remembered more by repetition than by notation. In China, zithers strummed with quiet resonance-filled evenings, while bamboo flutes carried thin, haunting notes through courtyards. Festivals in every culture echoed with music, rhythms shared by dancers and spectators alike. Beauty also lived in textiles and clothing. Roman togas draped in folds of wool, dyed in muted colors or bleached bright white. Chinese robes of silk shimmered softly, embroidered with fine designs that caught the light. In India, vivid dyes brought reds, yellows, and blues to cloth, while in Africa, woven patterns carried meaning in their symmetry and form. Everywhere clothing was not only functional, but a quiet expression of community and tradition. In every corner of the year zero, art and beauty reminded people of something enduring, that life could be more than toil and survival, that color and sound, pattern and form carried a nourishment of their own. And as evening settles, we drift onward. Knowledge in the year zero grew like a steady flame, small in reach but carefully tended, its light extending into corners of daily life. The Romans were skilled builders. Their aqueducts, raised on arches of stone, carried water from mountain springs into cities, ensuring baths, fountains, and households never ran dry. Roads stretched outward in remarkable lines, paved carefully with gravel and stone, crowned at the center so rain would wash away. These feats of engineering were not just monuments, they were practical gifts, connecting farms to towns, ports to capitals, and people to one another. In medicine, Roman physicians drew on Greek learning, balancing the humors of the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments involved herbs, diets, and sometimes surgery with bronze tools. While knowledge was limited, the careful notes of physicians and midwives preserved methods that, in some ways, echoed for centuries. China nurtured its own traditions of science and discovery. Astronomers studied the heavens, charting stars, planets, and eclipses. They measured time with clepsydras, water clocks that dripped steadily into carved vessels, marking hours by sound. Scholars observed the patterns of comets and constellations, linking cosmic events with the rhythm of earthly life. In medicine, Chinese physicians worked with a vast catalogue of herbs: ginseng for strength, ginger for warmth, and countless roots, leaves, and resins. Acupuncture, already practiced, sought to balance flows of energy within the body, a system different from Western methods, yet born from the same desire to heal. Mathematics, too, found its place. Roman surveyors measured land with ropes and rods, calculating straight lines for roads and boundaries. In China, counting rods laid on wooden boards allowed merchants and officials to add, subtract, and divide with surprising accuracy. Beyond these, practical knowledge thrived quietly in every household. Farmers understood the seasons, when to plant and when to harvest. Fishermen read the sea's currents and the flight of birds to predict weather. Weavers, potters, and smiths all carried deep knowledge of materials: how clay hardened in fire, how wool took dye, how iron yielded to hammer and heat. This was science lived, not recorded, but passed hand to hand across generations. Learning was not a race, but a lamp kept burning steadily. Each discovery, each practice was a contribution to the shared store of human understanding, shaping the ways people lived and endured. And as evening settles, we drift onward. The turning of the seasons was the truest measure of time. Across the world, in the year zero, people lived in close conversation with the earth and sky, watching carefully for signs of change. In northern lands, winter wrapped fields in silence. Trees stood bare, their branches scratching against pale skies. Snow pressed softly over villages, muffling sound, and smoke curled from chimneys as families huddled by firelight. Food came from stores laid aside, grain kept in clay jars, salted meats, dried fruit. Each meal in winter was measured carefully, for the cold months were as much about endurance as about rest. With spring came renewal. Frost gave way to tender shoots pushing upward through soil. Farmers in Gaul yoked oxen to ploughs, turning dark earth in neat furrows, while in China's river valleys rice seedlings were pressed into flooded paddies, water glinting beneath the sun. Birds returned, filling mornings with song, and festivals celebrated the planting season, moments of hope when families gathered to share early greens, herbs, and the promise of harvests yet to come. Summer stretched long and golden. Fields ripened in waves of wheat, barley, or millet. Shepherds led flocks to higher pastures, bells jingling softly against the open sky. Rivers carried boats heavy with goods, their sails swelling with warm breezes. In towns, market stalls overflowed with fruit: plums, apricots, figs, and grapes, sweet with the sun. Children played outdoors until dusk, the air alive with insects humming in the heat. Then came autumn, the season of harvest. Fields were cut by hand, grain tied in bundles, and threshing floors filled with the sound of flails beating stalks. Grapes were crushed into jars, beginning their slow transformation into wine. In China, millet and rice-filled granaries, their weight a reassurance against the winter to come. Autumn festivals lit fires, set tables with abundance, and gave thanks for the work of soil and sky. Beyond the temperate zones, other rhythms marked the year. In India, the monsoon winds brought rains that refreshed parched fields, greening the land in torrents. Farmers waited anxiously for their arrival, for without the monsoon, crops would wither. Along the Mediterranean, dry summers yielded to mild, wet winters that filled cisterns and nourished olive groves. In the deserts, people knew the cycles of drought and flood, measuring time by the rising and falling of rivers. To those who lived in the year zero, the seasons were not background. They were the stage upon which all life unfolded. Each dawn and dusk, each rainfall and frost shaped what was possible. The year's rhythm was nature's great calendar, and people followed its turning with patience and respect. And as evening settles, we drift onward. Travel in the year zero was measured not in hours, but in days, weeks, and seasons. Journeys unfolded slowly, the landscape changing step by step. In the Roman world, stone roads stretched across hills and valleys, their surfaces carefully layered with gravel and paving blocks. Couriers rode along these roads carrying messages sealed with wax, the hooves of their horses striking a steady rhythm. Soldiers marched in formations, their shields glinting in the sun, while merchants trundled carts loaded with amphorae of wine or sacks of grain. Inns or mansions stood at intervals, offering food and rest to weary travellers, though comfort was often simple. Bread, cheese, straw bedding, and a fire to warm, chilled hands. Beyond the empire, great routes of trade crossed deserts and mountains. The Silk Road was not a single path, but a web of tracks linking east and west. Caravans wound through sandy expanses, camels laden with bales of silk, spice, or gems. Nights were spent at oases, where tents flapped softly in desert winds and fires flickered against the dark. Travellers shared food, water, and stories, building small circles of community before moving onward at dawn. On the seas, travel was both dangerous and rewarding. In the Mediterranean, ships with square sails and oars hugged coasts, stopping at harbours strung like pearls along the shore. Athens, Alexandria, Carthage, Massilia. Sailors watched the skies, wary of sudden storms, but trusted their vessels to carry them across waters that connected more than they divided. At each port, goods were unloaded: glass from Syria, papyrus from Egypt, olives from Hispania, and others taken aboard bound for distant markets. Farther east, the Indian Ocean hosted its own networks of sailors. They waited for the monsoon winds, predictable and steady, to carry them from Arabia to India and then back again months later. On these ships, cargoes of pepper, cinnamon, ivory, and precious stones mingled with Roman coins, their stamped images travelling thousands of miles from their origin. Journeys were not only for trade. Pilgrims walked to temples and shrines, their steps acts of devotion. Scholars travelled to study with teachers, carrying with them scrolls of knowledge. Families sometimes moved, seeking new land or following kin to towns where opportunities waited. For each traveller, the road was both challenge and possibility, a thread that bound distant places into a shared world. Though slow, travel carried with it a sense of wonder. To leave one's home was to see new horizons, to hear languages unfamiliar, to taste foods prepared in other ways. And always, journeys ended with return, feet stepping back onto familiar ground, greeted by family, hearth, and the comfort of home. and as evening settles, we drift onward. The world of the year zero was seen through many eyes, but perhaps none with more wonder than those of children. Their lives were shaped by the rhythms of family, village and season, yet filled with play and curiosity. In Roman towns, children chased hoops down narrow streets, their laughter echoing between stone walls. They played with dolls carved from wood or moulded in clay, their clothes fashioned from scraps of fabric. Small ivory or bone pieces formed board games where dice clicked on wooden tables and moves were made with simple tokens. In courtyards they made toys of pebbles, arranging them into patterns or tossing them into the air to catch. In China, children's games included kites made from paper and silk, which lifted into the sky on breezes, tails fluttering. Others played with tops spun on flat ground or balls made from stuffed cloth. In villages, groups of children followed one another along paths to rivers, splashing water or skipping stones. Their shouts carried across fields, blending with the sounds of birds and farm tools. Yet childhood was not only play. From an early age, children learned by watching their parents. A daughter might sit beside her mother at a loom, threading fibers and learning the patience of weaving. A son might help his father guide oxen through a field, his small hands imitating the gestures of work. Tasks were simple: carrying water in clay jars, feeding goats or chickens, gathering firewood. But each chore stitched them into the fabric of daily life. For some, education meant letters and numbers. In Rome, wealthier families hired tutors who taught Latin and Greek, reading passages from poets like Virgil or Homer. Boys copied letters on wax tablets, the stylus scratching faintly on the surface, while girls, though less often formally taught, still absorbed knowledge through household management and storytelling. In China, scholars' children learned characters and classics, memorizing Confucian texts that carried wisdom about duty, respect, and harmony. But beyond lessons and work, the essence of childhood was its closeness to wonder. Children stared at stars from doorways, traced patterns in dust, and listened intently to stories told by parents and grandparents. These tales of gods and heroes, of clever animals or wise sages, wove imagination into memory. By firelight or lamplight, eyes grew heavy, dreams beginning where stories left off. In every land, children were reminders of continuity, the promise that life would go on, that families and communities would endure. Their laughter, their questions, their play brought lightness to the burdens of work. Even in hard times, the sound of a child's voice was enough to soften the day. And as evening settles, we drift onward. As the sun lowered in the year zero, life slowed into its gentlest rhythm. The day's work, whether in fields, markets, or workshops, gave way to rest. Across empires, kingdoms, and villages, people sought comfort in the same way, gathering with family, sharing food, and preparing for sleep. In Rome, as dusk colored the sky, oil lamps were lit, their flames flickering against walls. The smell of cooked lentils or stew drifted from kitchens, mingling with bread drawn fresh from ovens. Families sat together, eating slowly, voices low and unhurried. Outside, the city quieted, though faint noises carried, dogs barking, carts rumbling home, the distant echo of footsteps on stone. In Chinese villages, twilight brought soft coolness. Farmers rinsed their hands in basins, children finished their tasks, and families assembled around stoves still warm from cooking. Lanterns glowed with steady light, their paper shades softening the flame. Tea or broth warmed hands, and conversations lingered on weather, planting, or the health of relatives. Crickets sang in the fields, marking the close of another day. Elsewhere, similar scenes unfolded. In India, families gathered under courtyards open to the night, the air fragrant with spices. In Egypt, people sat on rooftops to catch cool evening breezes, looking out over the Nile as it shimmered in moonlight. In smaller villages across Africa and the Americas, fires were kindled, songs were sung, and stories passed in circles of warmth. The night sky was a shared canopy. Stars glimmered above Rome, Chang'an, Alexandria, and countless villages, seen by all, though named differently. The Milky Way stretched like a silver river across the heavens, steady and timeless. For shepherds guarding flocks or sailors at sea, those stars were guides. For families at home, they were mysteries, their distance hinting at worlds beyond reach. Evening brought not only rest, but reflection. The tasks of the day were done, and what remained was simply being with one's family, one's community, or oneself. In these quiet hours, the weight of empire, trade, and duty faded, leaving only the closeness of firelight and the comfort of routine. And as lamps dimmed, the world slowed into silence. The year zero, like every year before and after, ended not with declarations or records, but with ordinary people lying down to sleep, their breath soft in the darkness, their dreams carrying them gently forward. And as evening settles, we drift onward. The year zero was not a single moment, nor a single story, but a weaving of many threads. When we step back from its empires, its roads, and its markets, what remains most clearly is the rhythm of ordinary life. Picture again the hearth, glowing in a modest home. Clay walls hold warmth, firewood crackles, and the gentle light casts shadows across the room. A pot simmers with grain, bread cools on a wooden board, and a family sits close, their voices low. Outside, the world grows still, the air cools, and stars begin to appear. The hearth is not grand, but it is enough. Across fields, the cycle of the year continues. Winter's hush, spring's renewal, summer's fullness, autumn's harvest, each season flowing into the next with patient certainty. Farmers rise with dawn, shepherds guide flocks, children run along narrow paths. The earth offers its gifts, and people shape their days around its rhythm. The seasons are not hurried, they move in balance, steady and sure. In markets, the sounds soften as evening comes. Stalls are packed away, baskets carried home, coins tucked into purses. What lingers is the memory of voices, the calls of sellers, the laughter of buyers, the hum of human presence. Even when silence falls, the traces of the market remain, like the scent of fruit or the echo of footsteps on stone. Along roads and rivers, journeys slow. Caravans settle at oases, sails are furled in harbours, travellers find rest at inns. The dust of the day settles on cloaks and sandals, yet the weariness of travel fades into the comfort of stopping, of setting down burdens, of knowing tomorrow the journey will continue. In rest, the world seems wider, and the distances less daunting. Faith, too, though practiced differently across lands, carries the same quiet reassurance. In Roman homes, small altars glow with offerings. In Chinese villages, incense rises before ancestral tablets. In Judea, prayers are spoken softly, words carried like seeds into the air. In India, chants linger beside rivers. Everywhere, devotion is not distant but close, folded into daily acts. And so the year closes gently. Lamps dim in Rome, lanterns glow in Chang'an. Fires burn low in distant villages. Families gather, then disperse to rest. The world, vast and varied, slows into the same stillness. Stars shimmer overhead, rivers murmur, winds shift softly through fields. Sleep spreads like a tide, drawing the world into silence. As we linger here, let us imagine walking through these scenes one last time. A hearth in winter, warm and steady. A spring field, green with promise. A summer market, alive with voices. An autumn harvest, rich with abundance. A road stretching outward, and a night sky spreading wider still. Each image softens, fading like embers, like ripples on water. And so we drift gently into rest. The year zero passes not with a single sound, but with countless breaths. Millions of people closing their eyes beneath the same stars. Their lives a quiet continuation of those who came before and those who would follow. As the final lamp fades, as the last ember cools, we too close our eyes, letting the quiet of that ancient world carry us onward. And as evening settles, we drift onward and into sleep.